Hey guys, welcome to session 5 of Boundaries. This is called The Myths of Boundaries. Now, what is a myth? Well, sometimes myth is a story that communicates a great truth. What we mean by a myth here is that there are stories out there and narratives about boundaries that really are not true at all. In that way, it's a myth that is just not true. So we're going to try to debunk a bunch of those myths here. Now, what we did was we listened to gazillions of people and heard kind of like themes happening and lumped these into kind of the themes out there of what people have been told or taught in various contexts that are really destroying their boundaries. And another reason that we feel like these need to be debunked is a lot of times they get blamed on God. And you'll hear people using the Bible to support things that are really not right, and it's not what the Bible teaches. So we're going to go through some of those in this session. Myth number 1. Let's put this up here. We're going to talk about the myths. Myth number 1 is that if I have boundaries, I am being selfish. If I have boundaries, if I say no to someone, if I don't do what they want me to do or bail them out again, or I say no and I have some boundaries or separateness or freedom from them and I'm not doing what they desire from me, sometimes you will hear something like, well, I can't believe that you're that selfish. Now, why is this a myth? Well, first of all, there is nothing selfish about doing what you want to do with your own time, body, resources, energy, talents, abilities, etc. Now, there's another word that gets confused here that we got to bring in, and that is self-centered. See, that's a big difference. If we never give our time and resources and money and effort and body and all this kind of stuff, if we never extend ourselves to anybody else and we never give, that means that we're self-centered. It means that we think all of life should be about serving me. And that is destructive. In fact, there's a verse in the Bible that talks about giving. It says if you're in your giving, you sow sparingly, you will reap sparingly. The worst lives are by people that are self-centered. They think everybody ought to be giving to them all the time. But it's not selfish for you to say no to some things and to not give of yourself and have some limits and some boundaries. That's not selfishness. That's another word. It's actually stewardship. That you're having control over your time so you're not getting burned out. Remember when Moses was giving and giving and giving and helping everybody and his father-in-law came to him? Jethro says, Moses, what you're doing is not good. You will wear yourself out. Stop all of this overwork. And here's what you do. You find a bunch of other people to hear all these cases of the Israelites, and then you reserve just the hard ones for you to hear, and you do those and you delegate the rest of it. Say no to this stuff. Okay? Was he being selfish by saying no? No, his father-in-law said, you will burn yourself out. You will wear yourself out. But you know what? You know why you have this myth? Because a lot of self-centered people have probably accused you of being selfish when you're saying no for something. Or you have an inner voice that does it now. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan? Did you ever hear the story of the codependent Good Samaritan? What happened to the codependent Good Samaritan? Remember the story of the Good Samaritan? There's a guy beat up in the road. He comes along and says, oh my gosh, look what's happened to you. And he gives of himself. He says, let me put you up in the inn. I'm going to pay the innkeeper, give him money for your care. And that was actually an example that Jesus told of what it looks like to be loving. Then what does the Good Samaritan do? He says to the innkeeper, take care of this guy. I got some business I got to go attend to. I'll be back in a few days. What? You're going to leave me? I mean, what if the guy plays the guilt thing? And the Good Samaritan says, I'm going to go off for a few days and I'll be back to see you later. What? Are you kidding me? I've been beat up? Yeah, I thought you were a Christian. I thought you cared. Huh. Big giver, you starts laying the guilt on. And what if the Good Samaritan's a codependent? Oh yeah, I guess you're right. That is pretty selfish of me to go take care of my life and to go do some things for myself. You're right. Here, I'll just stay here. Isn't that just crazy? But see, people can manipulate you into thinking you're selfish when you're not self-centered at all. You've been giving a lot. it's time to say no. Go get some sleep, man, or go play tennis, or preferably golf, but do something for yourself. You know, it's like Paul says, do not merely look out for your own interests. Okay? Don't be self-centered, but also the interests of others. So life is about both. It's not selfish to have some boundaries and to say no sometimes. Okay, the second one. Boundaries mean that I'm being disobedient. And this happens a lot of times in church settings where people try to make people feel spiritually guilty about something. And really, you know, like they want you to do this or they want you to do that. And you go, no, really, I'm not. That's not something that I'm called to do or gifted to do, and you're in control of your own life. And what they'll do is sometimes put a big guilt trip on you and call it, well, you're not being obedient to God or to your calling or this, that, and the other. And really, you are being obedient to God. You're just not being obedient to them. And what they want to do is put this big control trip on you. And that's not being disobedient. That's being faithful to what you feel like that you are being called to do in the way that you're supposed to be spending your life. Now, if you're disobeying some overt principle that God says do, you know, thou shalt not lie, and you're lying, that's disobedient. But not doing what somebody else wants you to do unless you have chosen and placed yourself under their authority, okay? Like a boss, or if you volunteered for something in the church and there's a leader and they say, we want you to do this, and then you say no. Well, you can't have it both ways. But see, even the volunteering was an act of freedom. If you're working for a company, that was an act of freedom. And now you are freely giving them the right to tell you what to do, and you're obeying. If you give them the right to tell you what to do and you don't do it and call that boundaries, well, then you're a house divided, right? So if you say, I want to work for you, and then you tell your boss, I'm not going to do what you tell me, then you're a house divided. But it's not disobedience to not go to work there, right? Or not place yourself in some system, or to say no to somebody who doesn't have authority over you. So there's a balance. Okay, the next one. Boundaries mean I will be hurt by others. That if I have boundaries, I will be hurt by others. Basically, most of the time, this comes out of a fear. Like people have grown up in ways where if they say no, then they're going to get hurt by somebody. Somebody's going to be really mean, or somebody's going to be abusive, or somebody's going to, you know, harm them or injure them in some way, or they're going to withdraw love, or this, that, and the other. Now, can that happen? Yes, it can happen. It absolutely can happen. Probably 90% of the time, it's fears in somebody's head. You know, you say no to somebody, and they go, oh, okay, well, how about next week? And you go, oh, you don't hate me? Well, where they came up, you know, grew up from, or where they came from, then the tapes in their heads would expect somebody to be really mad at them. It doesn't happen. Sometimes it does, okay? In that, the other person can get mad, or they can get abandoning, or they can get whatever. But that's where you have to figure out, wait a minute, if somebody's going to do something hurtful because I stand up for what is right, then I still have to stand up for what is right, and I need to take care of myself so that whatever they do does not hurt me. And so you don't want to be held captive to some out-of-control person because you're afraid, right? And sometimes the extremes of that is you may have to go to a shelter, you may have to call the police, or you may have to call for help. But we can't have the fear of being hurt in some way keep us from doing what is right, because ultimately doing what's right is going to be best for them, and to hold somebody accountable. And fear is a big one. And I'm not acting like this is a small thing. I mean, some of you, the last thing you should do is confront somebody because you're in real danger, and you need to do what Proverbs says, which is to seek safety. You know, it says that the unwise person, you know, dives into danger and gets hurt, but the wise one sees danger and hides themselves. And so if there's real danger of that, don't let it hurt you is the point. Have the kind of boundaries that prevent you from getting hurt. But 99% of the time, a lot of these scenarios, we feel like something bad's going to happen. A lot of times it's in our heads, but we have to do the right thing either way. Okay, the next one is, if I have boundaries, I will hurt others. Okay? Well, this is an important one because sometimes you say no to somebody, or you set limits, or you say, if you continue to use drugs, I can't be around you. They cry hurt. They cry foul. How could you do this to me? You're so unloving. I thought you cared, and all this kind of stuff, right? But you know what? That's not harming them. And what really this should say is the difference between hurt and harm. Because sometimes when somebody is hurting because we set a limit, that's exactly what should happen. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, and it says, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. But in the end, it produces the peaceful fruit of righteousness. In other words, when we go through discipline, it hurts. So what we have to do is we have to evaluate this hurt, right? And when you know, if you throw an addict out, say, if you're not going to get sober, you can't live here, is that going to hurt? Yeah, it's going to hurt, but it's good hurt because of the hurt of discipline. Or somebody's not performing and they get fired, hopefully that'll be a wake-up call. Yeah, it's going to sting a little bit, but it's going to be a wake-up call to tell them, you know what, I got to learn to be responsible and show up on time. That is not going to harm somebody. But we feel like, oh, I can't do this. You know, I've got a friend who has this crazy cat, and she basically can have no boundaries with the cat. And so the cat takes over the whole house. And ultimately, you know what she said? She said she ended up sleeping on the floor because the cat just took over the bed. And it was just crazy. Why? Well, why don't you put the cat in a cage or lock the cat in the other room? You know what she said? Well, you know, I don't want to hurt its feelings. It starts to meow and it feels lonely. Are you kidding me? If it were up to me, the cat would be somewhere else. Now, come on. This over-identification with not thinking anybody's going to go through any discomfort in life, I promise you life will not work. You know, sometimes life has a little frustration to it, and that's good for us. So don't be afraid of causing that by doing the right thing. If somebody's bummed about it, that may be the best gift that you ever gave them. Okay, the next one. If I set boundaries, that means that I am angry. It means that I am angry. Well, where does this come from? Well, somebody gives in. Finally, the time when they finally say, I can't take this, then they blow up and they're enraged. And they've come to associate, you only set boundaries when you're mad. And if you're not mad, then pretty much anything goes. Well, there's a problem with that. You know what the problem is? People that are really angry, they're the ones that don't have boundaries. They're the ones that don't have self-control. Or they're the boundary busters that are violating boundaries. Here's what Proverbs says. It says, an angry man is like a city without walls. Think about that. How angry are we if people are violating our boundaries? We have no walls. We have no protection. And if you can't say no and you're always getting violated, you might be looking like everything's okay, but inside you're seething. And that seething is turned into depression and lack of energy and all this kind of stuff because you're being manipulated through life and you have no control and you're just about to explode at some level, but you're eating over it, or you're depressed, or you're anxious, or you're agoraphobic, or whatever it is, and that's not good. And it comes from being a city without walls. Here's the deal. In actuality, people that have good boundaries and they don't do stuff that they don't want to do, or they don't let people abuse them, they're not angry at all. They're the most loving people. And they're the most generous people because they're freely doing what they want to do. And so they're not bugged. I remember a lady asked me one time, she said, how do you deal with controlling people? I said, you convert them. She said, what do you mean? I said, you convert them. What do you mean convert them? I said, you convert them from being controlling to being frustrated. She goes, what are you talking about? I said, well, think about this. There's really no such thing as a controlling person, right? Unless you do what they want you to do. Think about that. Whenever you hear somebody say, well, you know, he's so controlling or she's so controlling, they're actually really mad at them because they're allowing that person to have control of them. and they're not saying no. They're not standing up. And so they feel controlled by this person. And so they're describing that person as controlling. But inside, I'm holding a grudge and I'm really resentful of how this person is controlling me. Until I learn to have boundaries. And when they try to control me, I say, you know what? I really don't want to do that. Then what happens to the controlling person? They get really frustrated. But they're not controlling anymore, are they? They're just whacked out and frustrated and maybe screaming, but you can't call them controlling because they don't have control of me anymore. See, if you have boundaries and you're a city with walls, you're not mad. And what do you do with a frustrated person? You empathize with them. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that it seems like it bugs you so much when I won't do that for you. That must really be frustrating. Am I angry anymore? No, I'm not angry at all. See, it's the paradox. The more in control of yourself you are, nothing to be angry about. You can be empathic and you can be caring about how frustrated this person is. They can't manipulate you, but you're not angry. See, that's the difference. People who have good self-control are not angry people. It's the opposite. And then the next one is we are afraid that sometimes it injures me when they set boundaries, okay? So when somebody else says no to us, see, we start to see boundaries as very destructive because if somebody says no to me or they don't do something that I would like for them to do or I want them to spend time with me and they say no, they'd like to do something else, we feel that is so injurious that we get a bad taste about their boundaries and just kind of boundaries in general. Sometimes that can cause us to not say no to other people because we say, well, I don't like it when I'm treated that way. And we turn it into something bad. Here's the deal. There's basically, if you do two kind of broad categories of good boundaries, one set is when somebody says no to giving us something that we desire. And the other set is when somebody sets a limit on our own behavior and confronts us and tells us that there's something we need to look at. All right. Well, in either of those cases, that should not injure us, okay? And if it does, it can injure us, but what I mean by it shouldn't is if it does injure us, really what's happening is there's probably some injury that we already have that limit is touching and it really, really hurts inside. So if we're walking around with a lot of abandonment or we've been hurt and rejected and this, that, and the other, and somebody says, no, I don't want to go to lunch with you, we feel rejected when in actuality what they said was, I don't want to go to lunch, right? And we hit a no, but it hits a button of injury that's already inside. Then it behooves us to go worry, why is it when somebody doesn't do what I want to do, why do I start to feel all bad? Why do I feel like I'm a loser and nobody loves me and it'll always be this way? I need to work on that because in my relationships, I need for people to be able to say no, and we still know that we love each other. So it's really not injuring me. What it's doing is it's tapping into a previous injury that I'm bringing to the scenario. You see this a lot of times in marriages. If somebody doesn't want to do everything the other person wants them to do, the other person feels unloved. And you'll hear that. When really that's, they need to have some separateness and ability to say no. It's like that country and western song, how can I miss you if you won't ever go away? And it's sort of like you have all that fusion. You see this in extended families, when there's not any freedom to do stuff apart from each other. Okay, there ought to be togetherness and there ought to be separateness. And the second one, when we confront one another in love, like if somebody says to me, Henry, you really had a bad attitude, or you sounded kind of gruff, or that wasn't cool the way you just acted. Well, here's the deal. If that injures me, then I've probably got some sort of critical voice in my head that makes me all bad when I'm confronted, and I need to get over that to be wise. Proverbs tells us that the wise person loves it when they get confronted. It says, confront a wise person, rebuke a wise person, and they will love you for it. Correct a wise person, it says, and they will become wiser still. They love it. They thank you. So if somebody confronts us and we get defensive and we don't see it as a gift, we've got some growth to do. So it's not true that when somebody has boundaries, it should injure me. If it is injuring me, it's a different problem, something that needs healing. It's not the boundary, by and large, that does that. Okay, now boundaries can be done in hurtful ways too, but that's not what I'm talking about. Okay, so it injures me. And then the next one, that boundaries cause feelings of guilt. Boundaries cause feelings of guilt. In other words, that when I have a boundary and I say no to someone, then I feel really guilty and I feel like I'm bad. So if I have boundaries, I come to believe if I have boundaries, I really am bad. I'm being selfish. There's something wrong with me. I've hurt them. I've wounded them. Okay? It's not the boundary that causes feelings of guilt. Do you think God walks around going to a codependency group to get over his feelings of guilt because he says no to you sometimes? I don't think so. And I don't think a lot of healthy people do either. A lot of healthy people say, no, I don't want to do that, or that's not best, or I'm going to do something else, or I have a different will in this situation, a different desire. And then they say, so what's for lunch? Because all they did was execute a normal human function. Like Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Let it be clean. Okay? But we can't do that sometimes. We think if we say no or have boundaries, I'm bad and I'm really guilty of something. Well, in actuality, what's happened is you've been programmed to, when you have boundaries, feel guilty because somebody tries to make you feel guilty and they give guilt messages. Like you say no and they go, oh, I thought you cared. Thought you were my friend. And they put the guilt message on you. Or parents, sometimes will say, well, after all I've done for you, it would seem that if I'm just asking for this little, after all I've done. And there's this indebtedness that people feel that's not the indebtedness of gratitude, it's the indebtedness of guilt. And when somebody puts a guilt trip on you and you feel like you've wounded them, in actuality, when you figure out a guilt trip is an attempt to control and they're really mad, then you know to handle it differently. Instead of feeling bad, you empathize with them and say, I can see it sounds like it's really frustrating to you. It sounds like even you feel like I'm doing something bad here by, having some time for myself. And so that needs to be talked about. But it's not something you get angry at or something you feel bad about or controlled by. So realize that, Jesus said something really cool one day. He said that he hired a bunch of people and he hired one at noon and one at 1 or one early in the morning or whatever, and all throughout the day. And then he hires some people kind of at the end of the day, and then he decides to pay them all the same thing. Well, the ones that got hired early were really mad. And they come to the guy and they say, wait a minute, this isn't fair. How come I work all day and I get this amount and he works for an hour and he gets the same amount? That's not fair. Jesus said, he looked at me and said, whoa. Didn't I pay you what we agreed to? That you said you would work. I said I would give you this amount. And you liked that deal and you said yes to it, right? Didn't I do that? Didn't you do that? And then he says, so if I want to pay this other person a different amount, and here's the phrase, I want you to remember this. Is it not, this is what Jesus said, is it not lawful for me to do what I want to with that which is mine? See, he could be generous. In fact, he said in the next verse, he goes, is the problem that I'm generous, or is the problem that you have an envious, which ends up being controlling heart? Is it not lawful for me to do what I want to with what is mine? See, your time and energy and heart and resources and all that, that's your stuff. You're not bad for giving some of that and saying no to some limit. The biggest foundations in the world and the most generous givers in the world, they give gazillions of dollars. A lot of times requests come in for gazillions plus 3, and they say, no, our charter and our purpose and how much we want to give this year and this and the other, here's the limit, so we'll give you this much, not that much, right? So they're not bad or selfish for not given the rest of it, that's purposeful. So be in control of what is yours. And then the last one is boundaries are, our fear is that they are permanent, and we're afraid of burning bridges. And if we say no, or if we have, some sort of limit, that means it's over and we'll never have a relationship with that person again. Absolutely not true. And in fact, sometimes boundaries are the beginning of what restores a relationship, even though there may be a gap. So what you got is you got a problem relationship that's going like this, and it's hurtful, and there's an addict or an abusive person or somebody like infidelity in a marriage or whatever. And so finally you set the limit, right? And say no more. And you're afraid I'll never see that person again. And what happens is there's a separation, and that separation causes that person to hit bottom. And when they hit bottom, they feel the pain of their own sin. And so what do? They start to grow and they come back, and there's a reconciliation. They get sober after a while. Sometimes they never do. That's just true. God has that problem. God says he's not desirous for any to perish. He wants everyone to come to him and have a relationship with him. But when he sets that limit and says, look, you got to come to the party. I'm offering you everything. Just say yes. Some people don't. And that's his limit. He says, I won't compromise what I want. I want a relationship with you. And if you don't want a relationship with me, I will let you go. And he doesn't win everybody over in the end either. We know that. But we do know that the boundary is the only way that causes anyone to be won over. So does it mean that sometimes if you set a limit that you might not ever hear from that person again? Yes, that can happen. But it's also true that it's the only way that you might hear from them again in a sober way, because the boundary will be what causes the good thing to happen. Okay? So I hope that helps. We get a lot of screwy stuff in our heads. One of the things that is so great about having a relationship with God, I remember when I came to faith, I was so screwed up. I didn't understand life. We've all got all this stuff in our head, and you try to make it work. You're making it work in your own ways, and you believe this, and if I do this, this will happen. And God's ways are not our ways. And what I loved about when I came to faith was, and I started studying the Bible, I found out that there were principles that were different than the way I behaved or the way that I understood life to be. And when I started doing it God's way, I found that good things actually happened. Perfectly all the time? Absolutely not. That's not how it works in this world. But when good things happened, it was because I was doing it God's way. That's a better way to look at it. So these myths are not what the Bible teaches. And as we've seen in all these instances, they're kind of the opposite of what the Bible teaches. But guess what? You may hear these things taught in churches. And what the Bible says very specifically is sometimes Jesus said that people in spiritual authority will teach their own traditions as if those are the oracles or the ways of God. That's why you got to always look at the Bible and test to see if somebody's teaching you something, is it really what God says? Because here's what the Bible says. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, freedom, and love. All the same thing. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom, liberty. And wherever there's liberty, what do you find? You find love. So, if you feel in bondage or slavery and this, that, and the other, that's not boundaries. Okay? Boundaries are about freedom. And boundaries are about love and obeying God and doing it His way. So examine these myths. Let me give you a few questions to go think about here.